A pleasure to meet y'all at last, and welcome back to Films I'm Willing to Talk About Again. And what I'm willing to talk about again for today is in fact something that is of course a sequel. A sequel to something that was probably unlikely to be successful. But apparently the Walt Disney Company itself has always had this thought in their minds that sequels should be better. And sure, you could practically argue that with the likes of most Pixar films. The likes of Finding Dory, The Incredibles 2, all the Toy Story sequels, and whatnot, each of them had actually become successful more so than the previous films. I mean, when you think about it, most of these have been in excess of $1 billion each. And so when you really think about it though, in contrast to their older counterparts, the newer films, the sequels, sure have in fact proven to be even bigger and better than the previous ones. Mostly because of the really big time gaps that happen between them. This is what does help to build a lot of excitement and a lot of wonder for what could possibly go down. But in any case though, we're going to talk about a sequel that was not necessarily as well known because it actually didn't do quite well. Homeward Bound 2, Lost in San Francisco. This was the fact that a sequel could actually be done, even by the Walt Disney Company, and still somehow prevail in the hopes of being a cult following. Or one that is somehow known, especially by today's standards, because the web exists. And you could basically search for it anytime, anywhere that you please. Rent it, buy it, whatever you like to do with it. But Homeward Bound 2, Lost in San Francisco is probably not one that you might think would actually do that well. Pretty much for the moment because it actually didn't do very well to begin with, but yet it does hold off pretty well as a sequel according to a lot of people out there whom have been putting reviews about it, from which I've seen in recent years. On IMDb or Quora or Yelp, anything else that typically has to do with film reviews. But yet, in terms of how this film does compared to the first one was a simple journey where three pets are out there on a ranch, a farm place, and they eventually make their way back home, encountering a lot of things that are very dangerous, like a bear, a waterfall, a porcupine, an animal shelter, a train yard, and a large muddy ditch. Just to name a few things. But the sequel actually does things a little bit differently. It takes place in San Francisco itself, the big urban scape that we've known and pretty much loved only because of how it was depicted as a cool place to live in within the movie verse. The films depict places better than how real life depicts them. And with the likes of a lot of proof out there that we've gotten over the years, lots of heavily populated cities of all sorts, from Manhattan, Cleveland, Houston, Tallahassee, Olympia, and anything else that has to do with well-known names, capitals, and whatnot. They sure are densely populated in every conceivable way. And for the most part, this could be a bad sign of some things out there. But in any case though, Lost in San Francisco pretty much does exactly what you might think it would do. To tell the story of how the likes of Shadow, Chance, and Sassy, three pets, are once again lost out there inside of a large part of the American landscape that we've known for a long time. Of course, the stakes are raised even higher because of the fact that this is an urban scape, as opposed to a rural scape, which the first film was able to depict really well as it was shot in some densely forested areas as well as some other locations throughout the whole state of California. But in San Francisco, however, it's a bit of a challenge as you'd have to deal with a lot of things out there, including the blaring of car horns, extreme traffic, unbelievably high levels of smog caused by emissions and whatnot from vehicles or otherwise. And then of course you have to deal with the consistent usage of various things out there. Firearms and weapons, a lot of bad temper, and plenty of psychosis. Lots of people out there who live in these kinds of cities do want to try and fit in with regular society as we've known about it. That's the sort of psychological feeling that some people might get. But many of us nowadays would much rather hang back a little bit and stick around in some smaller sized places, towns, villages, and I most honestly would want to spend a little bit of my time out there in a good selection of places. I could sure tell you that Beaverton, Oregon was a pretty unique place in and of itself. Didn't necessarily give you the kind of Portland style feel, but yet it did what it did best. And that's why I'm proud of it. Anyways though, with the plot itself, Homeward Bound 2 simply starts with a so-called family trip. The three pets do not realize that they're actually going to be going on a trip. They are in fact placed inside of small cages with pretty much no attempt to even follow with what is basically happening. As basically they just have no idea. They're not even being told about how they're going on a trip or whatnot, or being loaded onto the cargo shaft of a plane. So basically, they make their escape. They run out onto the runway where their own plane is taking off. And for the most part, that's basically not necessarily a good sign, because the family itself is pretty oblivious to this. And, well, for the most part, what does happen is that for a while, they eventually don't necessarily have any real bad feelings about it. Well, they're terrified for the most part. Their pets are out there lost in San Francisco, and they are not even close this time. The plane basically took the family pretty dang far away from California. And so, this is what basically ups the stakes even more so than the previous film did. But above all that though, the whole film itself is just a big combination of different events. They meet up with a bunch of other lost pets of all sorts, cats, dogs, and other things out there. They get involved with a shady group out there, a group of criminals in a large red van. And this red van is known to pop up in a lot of places around the city of California, mostly for kidnapping certain pets. Pets, of course, that do have rightful owners, but yet the owners themselves sometimes are just not very good caretakers of these pets. And so this red van does in fact show up with a lot of grudges and a whole lot of intentions to capture animals of all sorts. But of course there are a bunch of other things that happen out there, since the group eventually stumbles upon a large fire for the most part. And this is of course of which what made me so excited when I first saw this scene. I mean, I never quite felt like I was actually happy to see fire and flames. I must have been that bad of a person. So, lots of other things would also unfold in this film as well. Until eventually, the pets are reunited with their family again. How so? Well, they basically have to meet up with each other in the middle. Yeah, pretty much. The pets themselves had to pretty much get out of San Francisco and pretty much into the airport right where they had started. So, I really do feel like that this one's a bit more on the side of, well, the family having to come back to the pets rather than the other way around. The first film was about the pets being left behind on a farm. They escape from the farm and they make their way back to their own home out there. So, and this film does in fact do things too differently, in fact. It's not about the pets trying to reunite with their family, it's about the family trying to reunite with the pets. And both of these dogs, and the cat, of course, still do have, well, they do have the same voices of all sorts. And they do, of course, have the same old personalities that we've known from the first film. So, at least they keep their word on this. Much better so than most sequels of all sorts. They happen to change way too much for the plot, and sometimes have little to nothing to do with what the first film had shown. So, at least this is one good example of a sequel that has taken place, because it's simply a natural continuation of the plot from the first film from where we left off. Except this one takes place a little while later. So, in any case, that's just how I feel about this one in general. And I also do feel that maybe a lot of things could have been done that would have made this one probably even better than the likes of the first one, because the first one still holds off on its own just fine. Lost in San Francisco, though, did not necessarily do better than the likes of the first. Mostly in terms of how it was received by critics and by the box office itself. And so, unfortunately, not everything's supposed to be a success, but that just goes to show that sequels probably aren't meant to be made. And when you consider a lot of good films out there, ones that are so good that they don't even need a sequel, you basically have a lot to think about and a lot to correlate. Films are films. And as long as Hollywood continues to pretty much puke up lots of bad pieces of trash, we're probably never going to look at it the same way as we did 20 years ago. But you know, it is what it is, and I do feel like I have to at least give them credit for trying to give us something back in the day, to follow up with something else that they did back then. But keep in mind, though, that tomorrow is when all of this is going to come to an end. Yeah, it's basically been well over a month now since I started all of this, but for the record, I'm going to be getting back to work on a lot of things that I probably have to stay busy with at all times. So do keep in mind with that. But tomorrow, number 37. We also can't forget about all the bonus content that I've been putting out every now and then in this series, just like how I did with films I should have talked about years ago last year. And so, after some time, I will eventually have a second season of films I should have talked about years ago. But tomorrow is when all of this, films I'm willing to talk about years ago, will be coming to an end. So, if you want to see more go down on my channel, then make sure that you like, subscribe, comment, follow me on social media, and stay on the Hollywood side.